Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Oh Really Podcast, a podcast where I dive deep into those vulnerable, challenging, and spicy taboo topics that has the world wondering and so curious. And my goal is to destigmatize the fuck out of all these topics. So my name is Jess, and I'm your podcast host today. And today's topic, it literally has taboo all over it. And I don't know why, because we need to talk about this shit more. I'm in the medical industry and I'm pretty ashamed that I'm still very uneducated in this topic. So today we're talking about HIV, and I have an incredible guest speaker with me today who is HIV positive and has been for quite a significant amount of time. And he's very open and honest, and he's doing the same thing, you know, he's smashing stigmas and openly talking about these topics. So I am so grateful to have this absolute legend on the podcast with me today. A huge welcome to Nathaniel.
Hi. Oh, thank you so much for having me. From a well, it's just gone sunny here in Salford in Manchester in the UK. But this morning, it's supposed to be spring, and this morning it has been hailstoning, but the sun has just come out. So that's a good sign.
Is that a good sign? Because to me, hailstorm does not sound like a good time.
Well, welcome to climate change, eh? But we'll see how the rest of the day goes.
There we go. I love the accent so much. Have you spent most of your life in Manchester?
Well, Salford I've just moved to, but I'm from Greater Manchester, yeah, and I've kind of always come back here, done a lot of travelling. I've travelled around Australia, beautiful country, absolutely adore Australia, but I always come back home. I'm definitely a home bird.
Yeah, I love that so much. And I just love an English accent too. So thank you so much for finding time zone differences and coming on the podcast with me today, because that's the biggest battle, I think, when you're trying to do a remote podcast. So thank you so much again. And thank you so much for talking about such a massive topic about HIV. So you've got a pretty big story to tell, but instead of just diving straight into your story, I want to just start off the podcast with learning a little bit more about HIV, about human immunodeficiency virus and AIDS and the kind of difference. So in your kind of own words, how do you describe what HIV is?
Yeah, so well, you went straight in there with a proper full scientific term, which not many people know, which is human immunodeficiency virus, and it's in the title, so it's a virus, right? So it's not a living entity. It's like what would give you similar to what would give you flu or COVID. COVID is a virus as well, and it's a really crafty little virus because it attacks the immune system. So all viruses need a host cell to live in. And within whatever kind of organism that they are kind of living within. So human is in the title, it needs to be human. The virus enters the body, and that's usually through sexual fluids, but it can be transmitted from mother to baby during childbirth, and through sharing needles. Also, mothers can pass it on through breast milk, although it's really, really rare now with effective medication and stuff. Vertical transmission between mother and baby is really quite rare. But using sharing needles can also transmit the virus into the body. And once it's in the body, it seeks out the CD4 cells or the T cells, which are the first line of defense of your immune system. So they're the kind of infantry soldiers going out into your body looking for infections. And when they find infection, it alerts other cells and they come and they destroy the infection. So it enters those cells, and a virus needs to use your DNA to turn that cell into a factory. So it strips your DNA, which is 2 strands of RNA, separates it, and attaches itself to your DNA, and it turns that little cell into a tiny little factory. And instead of a cell that recreates itself, it recreates copies of the virus. And then once that cell is completely full of the virus, it bursts, and then it does its thing and moves on around the body.
I love the way you just said that, by the way. Like, I love the visual. Like, you're definitely a storyteller. I've got the little factory in my head, and I was like, you are so good at explaining this. I love this. Thank you so much.
And so then that goes on, and then it does its thing. And so over time, your CD4 cells, your T cells, become depleted, and your immune system weakens. And when your T cell count drops below around 250 copies, that's when you start per millimeter cubed of blood. That's when you start to kind of be more vulnerable to other infections. So untreated HIV will lead to that stage, and then eventually, you will catch all sorts of other kind of infections, aggressive pneumonias, and then you can also develop very aggressive cancers, Kaposi's sarcoma, and a whole range of other really, really awful illnesses. And that's when, at that point, if you had a collection of those, you may get an AIDS diagnosis. Although the term AIDS, because it's so stigmatized and so loaded, particularly here in the UK, and I think globally it's shifting as well, we tend to use the term advanced HIV because AIDS is just we need to consign it to history because it's never gonna have a rebrand. Do you know what I mean? It's got such negative connotations. So often, you sort of don't really hear it that much. And that's when someone would have an AIDS diagnosis. Now, if you get an AIDS diagnosis or advanced HIV diagnosis, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to die today because medications are really, really effective. But obviously, in the early part of the HIV and AIDS epidemic in the 80s and 90s, before effective medication, getting a diagnosis of being HIV positive or then moving on to an AIDS diagnosis in almost 100% of cases meant you were going to die. So a really, really, a really, really heavy kind of diagnosis to get. And still is today, even though there is effective medication and how it can be treated.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for explaining that in your terms. I think you did such a good job. You've obviously done this so much, explaining what it is, because I think a lot of people are throwing the word AIDS out a lot. And it is a word that we need to kind of get rid of and abolish in our language because it's not AIDS anymore. We just call it HIV. So I'd never heard of advanced HIV. So I'm really glad you brought that up. So people listening, if you're going to have these discussions, get rid of the AIDS wording. It's gone forever now and use the appropriate terminology. So long story short, HIV is something that you contract through bodily fluids, as you mentioned, through needle sharing, blood contact, and there is no cure because it is technically a virus, which I think is the scariest thing for someone to hear, and there is no vaccine. But medication and our incredible healthcare system has actually been able to create medications to live long, happy lives. Would you be able to explain those medications? So if someone goes into the doctor surgery and they get a diagnosis with HIV, what actually is it? So I know it's called antiretroviral therapy, ART, but could you kind of give me an understanding of what this medication is?
Yeah, so I actually, there's a different terminology which I even prefer, which is HAART, which is highly active antiretroviral therapy, which spells heart, not quite spelt the same as the actual word heart, but I quite like that. ART is or sometimes known as combination therapy as well. And in around 1996, when they discovered combination therapy, it was a game changer because they'd been trying lots of experimental drugs on HIV. Nothing was really working. AZT, which was this old shelved cancer drug that had been shelved from the 60s, they went, we're going to try that, and tried that. And it seemed to work actually in the late 80s, early 90s, and people on trials. But then after a certain period of time, the virus sort of outsmarted the drug and started to replicate again, and people got sick. So there was always this goal of trying to find a therapy that worked, and scientists realized, 1996, that you needed a combination of different types of drugs. So a single drug on its own wasn't going to do it because the virus mutates every single time it replicates. And so it was outsmarting how the drugs were working. So what they did is they tried a combination of 3 different drugs that interfere with the virus in different ways. And you can get really scientific and go into how they interfere with the virus. Some sort of stop it locking onto it, some stop it going inside, all these kind of different things. And so they realized at that point, when you did that, the virus couldn't outsmart the drugs, and so the virus became suppressed. So the aim of taking ART therapy is to bring your viral load to a point below 40 copies per milliliter cubed of blood, and that's now known today as undetectable because the scientific test can't detect any virus below that level. And if you're undetectable, and this is something that we've known since about 2017, if you're undetectable, you have an undetectable viral load, you now can't pass the virus on to your partners. And that has been scientifically proved in a myriad of studies all across the globe in lots of different scenarios with heterosexual couples, with gay couples, with people in monogamous relationships, people not in monogamous relationships, and there's not been one instance of transmission. So the aim now of going on to ART is to get your viral load undetectable, which normally for most people happens within the first 6 months. And then essentially you get on and lead your life, and you're taking 2 or 3 tablets. Some people take a once a day tablet. Mine's a once a day tablet, which combines all the different drugs together. And for the most part, it's relatively easy. Some of the drugs do have some side effects. Some people struggle to find a combination that works for them. The first combination I went on caused lots of psychological problems for me, which I'll tell in my story. Some people get other, symptoms, problems with their tummy, or different kind of issues. But there's so many different drugs out there that normally, eventually, someone will find a combination that kind of suits them and their lifestyle, and that they can stomach and take. Because the important thing is you have to take it every single day at the same time, and you need at least 98% adherence to your medication for it to be effective. So it's got to be a medication and a therapy that people can take. And that's why scientists work really hard to move towards once a day tablets and away from, if you've seen the film Philadelphia, these kind of regimes with fistfuls of pills that people were taking and all the side effects that they had. So it's really, really effective. Unfortunately, not everyone across the globe has access to this medication. And so the real push now is to get universal access to medication if we're ever going to try and eradicate HIV.
It's pretty amazing that medicine's come such a long way that we're able to just take a pill a day and to have it undetectable in your blood. That is unbelievable. And it's the same as, like women taking birth control pill every single day, chopping and trialing different types of birth control. Sometimes it doesn't work for you, so you try a different one, but the aim is to not get pregnant, right? So it's the same thing. You're just taking a daily medication, which is incredible. And how often do you have to get your blood test? Is it like a 6-monthly blood test to check your viral load? Is this a monthly thing?
Every 6 months, I go, and that's it, and have everything checked as well. So all the other vitals are checked, and the bloods are all taken, and weight is all taken, and you have a little mental health check in and everything with your nurse. So in a sense, you kind of, we often talk about people living with HIV maybe possibly living longer lives now because we're actually more engaged in healthcare than most people. Most men, and we're going to gender it here, most men are not great at going to see their doctor. And often we know diagnosis of things like cancer and other serious illnesses are often seen later in men because they have an attitude of, I'll just get on with it. I don't need help or whatever. But for people like me, we've got to go. And so, anything that's coming up, we're going to catch, really, really soon, really quickly. So that's a great thing to know. And as someone who, I've lived with HIV for 20 years, so I've lived through a lot of the history I've just spoken through. It's really reassuring to know that I get that level of care because, thinking about keeping healthy for the future is really important.
Yeah. Now, I think the listeners would be like, wait, 20 years. And especially the video listeners right now watching the video, they'll be thinking, hang on, you're very, very young looking. And I think this is a good leadway into, I guess, your story, your diagnosis story, because you got diagnosed at a very, very young age, because you are very young still at the moment. But to have this diagnosis for a whole of 20 years is huge. You've definitely gone through quite a journey. I would love for you to share your story about how you did contract this virus. And I guess I'm quite I get really interested in learning about the medical side as well. Like obviously things have advanced and they've got, you just said you had a mental health check-in every time you have that 6-monthly checkup. I feel like 20 years ago, this wasn't the case. They weren't plugging people into the system to get the proper help. And psychologically, this would have been a really hard time for you. I would love to dive into your story and also the diagnosis of the doctor surgery as well.
Sure, yeah. So, well, you flatter me when you say I look young. It was my sister's hen party this weekend, so I'm feeling a little bit bedraggled under the eyes. But other than that, I'm 37 years old, and I was diagnosed when I was 16. So, yes, it's actually coming up to 20. It'll be 21 years this coming November, and so if we go back to 2003, I was at school. I was head boy in just a state school, nothing special, but they still had a head boy system, and I was a straight A student, a high achiever. Was in music clubs and drama clubs, and was really, really kind of loved school, but school was also a really homophobic place. And here in the UK, in the late 1980s, actually part of whipped up homophobia from the AIDS crisis. A law was enacted called Section 28 or Clause 28, which stopped schools or any public body actually openly talking about, or in their words, promoting homosexuality as an alternative to a family life. So what that meant was that in schools, sex education, which is pretty poor anyway, had almost little to no reference of being gay within it. And then things like homophobic bullying and stuff in my school was not dealt with in the same way that, say, racist bullying might have been dealt with. And there was very much a culture of, it was okay to, the word gay was used as a derogatory term. So, I've got maths, that's so gay. And people who were different, or like me, who were into drama or whatever, or, hung around with the girls were definitely singled out. And I was bullied quite hard at school for that. But what that meant was that sex education was really poor. And I remember in one class, we watched a video, and it was about a gay guy who was dying of AIDS. And it was out of date, actually, the video. But I remember sitting in front of the class and this is the first time I'd seen another gay person. We didn't have representation on TV like we do now. There wasn't. If pop stars were out, it was normally, like George Michael being exposed by the press, or Freddie Mercury dying from AIDS. So it was not the kind of positive representation. So I had this really awful experience seeing this person die and going, oh, that's who I know. That's who I am, and that's my fate. So anyway, we fast forward to the summer. I've just left school. And I want to go to the prom with the deputy head boy. We had a secret little fling going on, but it wasn't going to happen. So I decided to make a statement in a cream tuxedo. So I was waiting. I went to the shop to pick up the cream tuxedo, and it wasn't there. And he said, it's going to be another 2 hours before it gets delivered. So I went and sat in a park, and it was in this park that I met someone who came sat over next to me. And he was this exotic gay creature. He was older than me, about 10 years older, I think. And he had bleach tips in his hair and ripped jeans and, and a tan and just sort of everything that you sort of go, oh, that's who I'm going to be. It was intoxicating to see someone be open in that way after all that sort of shame and secrecy. And I knew it was sort of, I shouldn't be exchanging numbers with someone who's just approached me on a park bench, who's older than me. I'm not stupid, but also part of me wanted to rebel a little bit from that kind of safe middle-class suburbia, church going, straight A life that I was sort of living. And it was exciting. And I think everyone at that age has a little rebellion, don't they, of some sort. So we hit it off and we went on dates, and he was actually really lovely. It didn't feel predatory at all, although looking back, I look at it slightly different with adult eyes when I look back on what happened. But it wasn't sort of just a one night thing. We dated. He took me to Canal Street, which is Manchester's gay village, which is very famous, world famous as a place, a mecca for LGBTQ nightlife. And eventually, I went back to his place, and it was happening. And this is my first full, time having full sort of sex with someone. And he reached to the bedside table, and he opened it and pulled out a safer sex pack and a bottle of poppers, which obviously for gay sex is very useful. I didn't know what they were at the time, but I do now. And he pulled out these safer sex packs you get in bars, gay bars around Manchester. So there are 2 condoms and 2 packets of lube in them. And they were, they've been around for years as a way to sort of fight HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. So I thought, great, we don't have to have a conversation. But he put the condoms to one side and just took the lube. And I said, I wasn't stupid, I'd seen that video, and I said, no, hang on a sec. I think we should use protection. And he just said to me, it's fine. I've just been tested, and I've had the all clear on everything. So I guess at that stage and that age, and the kind of um, experience level that I had, which was was non-existent. He's showing me the ropes. It's my rite of passage, yeah. So you just go fine, and you don't really have the tools to navigate that conversation because, like I say, sex education was really poor, and still also grappling with all this sort of stuff about being gay and going, is this, what am I doing here, and feeling that maybe what I'm doing is wrong, and all that sort of stuff. So anyway, we have sex, and it wasn't great the first time because gay sex is something. It's an art you have to practice, and once you've got it, it's great. But we saw each other more and more, and we were, I guess, dating, you could say. And then my mum and dad found out, and said he was too old, which I agreed, and we sort of ended it. And then we fast forward a little bit further to later in the summer, and I'm on holiday with my parents, and I get very, very sick whilst on holiday in Menorca. And we're talking vomit from both ends at the same time, kind of sick. And I lost 2 stone in weight over the next few weeks. So that was what's known as your seroconversion. So that's when your body recognizes that it's got the virus, and it's normally 3 to 6 months after it's transmitted. So there's this latency, this window period, and that's often where people don't know they've got the virus and they transmit it to other people because they've not had any symptoms yet, and they've not been. That's why regular testing is really important, because it may pick up during that window period. Anyway, so I got very, very sick, went to the emergency doctors when we came home with my mum. He just said probably waterborne virus. Obviously, a young man presenting with his mum is not sort of thinking about HIV in his head, although he should have been, and didn't ask the right questions. So I started college in the autumn, and I look at pictures, and I was really slim and sort of looked very sick when I started college. And then I started getting other symptoms downstairs. So discharge, all sorts of things, itching, just what every 17-year-old wants. I was still 16 at the time, 16-year-old wants, whilst they're just like starting a new college and meeting new people. So I go to the hospital because that was the place where what they used to call the GUM clinic, the genitourinary medicine, but now they call them, normally they're at family planning centres more often these days, or kind of sexual health clinics. And and they asked me if I wanted the test, and I said no, because you could opt out of HIV back then. So because I just flat out refused to believe that it could be that. I got tested for everything else, and I had a shopping list. I mean, genital warts, gonorrhea, non-specific arthritis, all these other infections. So they were all treated, and then they kept calling me back because the doctor recognized that I most likely was showing the symptoms, and he was checking my lymph nodes and all sorts of things. And, he saw all the warning signs. He'd lived through the 80s and 90s. Eventually I conceded to have the test. And then 2-week wait back then to get your results. And then I went up to the hospital on my own after college one day on the bus, and I went into the clinic, and it was the last appointment of the day. And I remember it was very empty, and there was a long corridor with sort of all the different rooms coming off it, consultation rooms. And the nurse called me, and we walked down the corridor, and we passed every single room. I was like, I've never been this far down the corridor. And then there's a door at the end, and inside that room are 2 chairs, 2 armchairs, and a table with a box of tissues in the middle. And you knew straight away, before I'd even entered the room, this is where I get the news. And so she told me straight away, she said, we don't wait around. Your results are positive. Now you know, and then we can deal with the fallout. And that was the moment my life changed. I spent about a couple of hours there, obviously a lot of crying, and them talking me through what the next things were. At that time, you weren't put onto medication straight away. So the guidance was different to it is now. We didn't know about you because and there weren't as many medications around, because it was only about 6 or 7 years after effective medication had come in. So there was all this thing about whether you could stomach the medications or not. So we did leave it for a period of time. So I was actually about 5 years without medication. And then I went home on the bus, and I just had this choice as to whether to sort of walk into the kitchen and say to my mom, this has happened and I need my mom, I need you now I'm a child, like, help me. Or go, no, you're an adult, you've made your decisions, you've made your mistakes, and deal with it. And I chose the latter, and I went upstairs to my bedroom and closed the door and boxed it up. Well, I mean, I lined up some paracetamol that night, but never did it. I think I just watched too many kids' TV dramas. It's just a bit like, this is what you do when something like this happens. But obviously, to 16-year-old me, it felt very real. And so I didn't tell my family, and I've told very few people for 15 years. So I'm very open now, but actually I lived for most of that time, those 20 years, in secrecy and shame and silence.
Oh, that is so heavy, honestly. Like, and you think of like, I think about when I was 16, like you're such a child. Like, honestly, like, even early 20s, mid 20s, like, and going from 20s to 30s, like you change so much, but actually being in that teen period, that is so young. And I'm so sorry that you had to deal with that in school, 20 years ago. Like, times are changing, like, for the better now, but that is horrendous that you had to sit there and watch videos like that and already have this horrendous shame and scare factor in you before even going into that room of the doctor surgery as well. Heavy stuff. So yeah, you had two decisions to make, and you decided to go upstairs and close it up. Did you, I mean, when you had that time at the doctor surgery, you had said you spoke to them for a few hours, lots of tears. Was there psychological help put in? Were they just literally like, okay, if you go home now? Was there any follow up? Like, what did you do? Did you just carry on life and bury it?
Yeah. Well, I think I was quite lucky because I was young, and actually I was in this strange sort of place between 16 and 18, where if I was under 16, I would have been classed as a child, and the whole way that the system would have operated would have been different. I was in this period. I'm not quite an adult, but I'm still sort of like, so I know, I don't know, but I assume that probably the clinic probably alerted the local safeguarding authorities within what was happening here, and that probably went to my college, I would have suspected. I told my tutor at college the next day, and she was really supportive. And actually, the principal of the college, his sister had been a HIV nurse, and we sort of made this really, really beautiful friendship. And I used to have lunch in his office all the time. He'd see me in the canteen. He'd be like, "Nathaniel, have lunch in my office tomorrow." And there'd be this full spread of sandwiches and cakes, and we'd sit and chat. And he offered me, a lot of I guess what you'd call psychological support. At the clinic that they did, I think that I got more than most people do or did, because they recognised my age and the need for that, and and very much said, "We're here. Call us if you need us. Come back when you need us." Um, um, and in that early part of when you're first diagnosed, you are called back to the clinic more than every 6 months. So it's not just like, oh, here's some literature and you'll come back in 6 months. It's every couple of weeks, and then it moves to every few months, and so on, until you've kind of come to terms with it. But I know lots of other people who didn't receive that, and still don't. They feel very much like they get the diagnosis, and then that is sort of like, off you go into the world. And even today, although things have changed so dramatically, even in the 20 years since I was diagnosed, it's still a life-changing diagnosis, even if it's not a life-limiting diagnosis. So it's really important that people get support. And we often say now that HIV stigma and shame is the thing that ruins people's lives, not the virus itself. The virus we've sorted and we've dealt with, but it's all the societal attitudes around it and the way that it's transmitted, that caused the problems. And it was the psychological problems of HIV that led me to the kind of crisis point I got to 5 or 6 years ago, which then sort of everything shifted and changed in my story, and I started speaking publicly about it.
Yeah, that's very similar to HSV. So I'm very open about being HSV2 positive. So that is the herpes virus. The virus itself is not that bad at all. It's purely the psychological stuff, the social stigma, trying to disclose to partners. Like that is the worst part of actually even being diagnosed with something like this. And the actual virus itself, I don't even bat an eyelid about it because there is antiviral therapy. It's similar. Obviously, they're completely different viruses, but it's that, that taboo stigma world where you're dealing with the psychological impacts and social stigmas. That's why I've created Oh Really podcast, is just to create community and to create a platform and for people to listen to these stories and go, wow, I've just learned something, and that's so right. Like we need to change our language, and wow, things have come so far in the medical world that people can have undetectable, virus loads in their blood. People don't know this stuff. And that's why I'm just so grateful to have you on today and for sharing, because even though you've shared this story so many times, it can be really hard, and it's a really hard thing to share something like this. Like I've gone through like absolute scary times, even talking face to face with someone versus on an audio thing, video call, on stage. Like it's so scary, but then you become really proud of yourself for doing it. And you're like, I'm going to do this to change other lives. Like it's not about me, it's about spreading awareness and creating community. So explain to me what happened a few years ago. So you had gone this whole time without telling your close friends and family. You had told a few people, as you mentioned, at college and stuff, and you had those support networks, but you still kept this very, very hidden from your very, very loved ones. What happened a few years ago? What was the shift that finally happened where you decided to open up?
Yeah, so I, like I say, 15 years of life flew by, and that's what it does, doesn't it? What's the quote, C.S. Lewis? Isn't it funny how day to day nothing changes, but when you look back, everything is different? Like how time kind of compresses when you look back. So yeah, 15 years of life happens, and I go to university, I get a degree, I'm in a relationship for 8 years, that ends, and then I'm dating again, and then I'm in another relationship. I've traveled, I travel the world, I've backpacked, I do all the things that I want to do with my life. And in a sense, the diagnosis doesn't hold me back, but it does weigh heavy in my life, and it impacts my relationships. And, and over time, it starts to, the trauma of what happened starts to compound, and the relationship I'm in, sort of from about 2014, I think, onwards, is a really codependent relationship. It's very toxic, and in fact, it becomes abusive. And I'm sort of stuck in this cycle of psychological, emotional, and physical abuse. But also within that relationship, there's a lot of drug taking, there's a lot of alcohol, there's a lot of risk taking behaviors going on in terms of sexual behaviors. And I guess I always go, I was telling myself at the time I was living my best queer life. Like I don't need to live by society's rules of how we have to have relationships. I can do all these wild and wonderful things. But really, those in of itself, drugs, alcohol, sex, they're not bad things, but they are if you're using them to self-medicate, and that's exactly what I was doing. And so I sort of catch myself, still awake 2 days after a house party, like multiple times, and realizing that I've become, whilst I'm not an addict, I've certainly become heavily dependent on drugs and alcohol. And I'm behaving in ways that I look back and go, I really wish I hadn't done that. And the way that I was, whilst my partner was abusive, I was also behaving in ways that were pretty poor. And realized at that point that something had to change. And I knew what it was. It was the secret that I was carrying that was causing this. So I did what any self-respecting person would do. I'm a theatre maker, a writer, a performer, and I went, I'm going to make a show about it. So I wrote a one-person show. And I got a commission, a small commission in a theatre in South Manchester. And once we got that commission, it meant that the train was out the station. There was a date in the diary, the weekend of World AIDS Day, 2018. The show was going to go on. So I had to tell my family. So I wrote a letter I've got two older brothers, a younger sister, and my mum and dad, and we're a very close family. But I just couldn't face. I tried so many times to say it, and the years had gone. I'd got so great in number, and I just thought I can't get everyone together because that's like weird. Like, I used to remember in Neighbours, there was one family that always used to have a family meeting. I was like, no one has family meetings. Who has family meetings? I think it was the Robinsons always had family meetings. And I was like, nah,
the Robinsons always do it.
Yeah, it's like, that's not a thing. No one has family meetings. Maybe they do. Not my family anyway. And then I thought, I can't tell everyone one after another because I'll just be a shell of a human. I'll have to take like 4 weeks off work just to recover. So I thought, I'll write this letter. I'll get everything out on the page that I want to say. They can read it. They can have their reaction in private, which I think is actually really useful. I say to people, if you're worried about telling someone, like coming out, or about with your sexuality or gender, or something like a big piece of news like this, and you're worried about their reaction, write it down, send it to them. They can have their reaction in private, whether they want to cry or get angry or whatever. They can then compose themselves and then come to you, and you can have a face-to-face once everyone's calm. So I sent this letter to them. It was quite underwhelming, really. I got a text from everyone. My sister sent me a text, "I still love you." My mum turned up the next day on the doorstep with a house plant. I was like, "Have you got a house plant?" She's like, "I don't know. I was wandering around the supermarket going, what do you buy your son when he tells you that news?" It's like, not a house plant. It was a very nice house plant. But it was a journey from there on. I made the show. They came to see it. Obviously, it was really, really hard because the show contained more stuff about the story, and I thought the show would just I'd just get it out of my system. It was a selfish act. It was about going, I need to get it out. And it just really resonated. And my story was picked up by local press, then national press, then international press. So I was doing this tiny little show. They had to put an extra one on because there wasn't enough, it was so sold out. And yet, there was global coverage. There were BBC News articles that were shared all across the Spanish-speaking world on BBC Mundo. I was on national television, breakfast television here in the UK, whilst I was doing the show. So it was literally from 0 to 100 overnight. And then since then, the show went on to be performed 100 times, toured all the UK. It landed me a role in It's a Sin, which I think has been shown on some channels in Australia, which is a story of gay men in the 80s in London dealing with the AIDS crisis. And, it's kind of given me all these opportunities, and I've been on every single news channel, every breakfast program in the UK, and spoken about my experiences. But interestingly, what you were saying before about that thing of how it feels to tell your story or talk to people. I remember making the show and doing all that stuff, and all amazing, and getting that kind of coverage for a tiny little theatre show. I'm not a big commercial theatre maker. I'm just some kid from Stockport, making this little show. Didn't cost a lot of money to make. Wasn't big production values or anything. And I'd done all that. And then I remember after all the hubbub had died down, about a week after, and all the messages had sort of stopped, and I had thousands of messages from all around the world that all died down. And I went to get my hair cut. I mean, I don't have any hair now, but I used to have hair. I went to get my hair cut at the barber's, and I sat in the chair, and started cutting my hair. And the barbershop's quite a macho environment. Sometimes as gay men, we don't always feel that comfortable, and that's also our own prejudgments about the men in that space, but they come from, being bullied when we were younger or whatever. And so you're sometimes a little bit on edge. And he asked, "What do you do?" And I was like, "Oh, right. Okay, now I have to say it one-on-one to somebody who's here, in my personal space, because saying it on stage in the spotlight where you can't see the audience feels safe, or talking to you here in this controlled environment feels safe because the people that listen to it will listen to it, days and days after I've said these words, and I won't be there when they hear it. When you do it one-on-one to somebody you don't know, that's really scary. And I realized at that point, that's the coalface of activism, because that's the place where most people, I'm very lucky, I'm very privileged, I've had the platform that I've been given to tell my story. Most other people don't get that, and most other people are not safe to even do that either. And so we have to create a world through those one-on-one conversations where it is safe for people to have those conversations and feel confident and comfortable to get in a taxi and the taxi driver say, "Oh, why are you going to the hospital?" "I'm going for my HIV bloods." You know, it needs to be that normalized. And so those one-on-one conversations are the hardest. And I almost didn't say it, after all that. And I thought, what a fraud to stand up on the stage and speak to, on BBC Breakfast News to the nation and say all this stuff and then not be able to do it in reality. And that was the first step to being really truly open and being able to say it. Because like you say, every single time you say it, there's a rush if something comes back, and you have to remind yourself that you're safe and push those feelings from the past down. And that's the thing that we all live with. That's the psychological side of it. That's the impact that it has.
Yeah. Do you find the more you talk about it, like the easier it gets? So like obviously you still get that like that fear, but then you kind of get over that fear, and then the next time you do it, it just gets that little tiny bit easier to talk about it, and then more and more and more, and then eventually it just flows out, and you just don't care.
Oh yeah. People can't shut me up anymore.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I went the opposite way, and maybe it's a survival tactic. I don't know what it is, but it has only served me well. The last 5 years, my career has skyrocketed. My relationships have improved. My relationship with my family is better than ever. I'm in a beautiful, loving, stable relationship now because I've committed to talking about this and going to therapy. I've got complex post-traumatic stress disorder from both the diagnosis and from the last relationship I was in and everything that happened, and generalized anxiety. And actually going, if I'm going to lead a happy life, I've got to sort that stuff out. I've got to sort that shit out myself. No one's coming to save me from that. And that's, if we want happy, healthy relationships, that's our duty to our partners to do that. So, as my therapist says, it's like, you can run away from your problems all you want, but they'll always be faster than you, and they will always catch you up, and they will always kick your foot and trip you at some point. And that's normally self-sabotage, and you don't realize you're doing it. That's how these things play out, and that's what was happening in my previous relationship. With all that kind of toxic behavior and the drug taking and things. So yeah, talking about it definitely makes it easier. And whether I talk about it as obsessively for the rest of my life or not, we'll see. But at the minute, it's serving me well. So I'll keep talking. And I will, like I say, because I'm privileged, I'm white, I'm male, cisgendered. I get a lot of privilege in this world and often get platforms that people don't. So I'm trying to pave the way and make opportunities. And I've done lots of projects and work to try and amplify different voices. Black British women living with HIV, white British women living with HIV, voices we don't necessarily hear in this discussion. Straight men living with HIV, and amplify their voices through the work that I do, so that I can step off stage and make space for someone else to step into that spotlight.
All right, everybody, we're going to interrupt the episode to play Two Truths and a Lie. And this is a fun way for us to know about Nathaniel a little bit more than the topic that we've discussed today. So Nathaniel, I would love for you to share with me your two truths and a lie.
Okay, right. So my first one is I once fell out of a first story window onto solid concrete.
Okay.
That's my first one. My second one is I grew up my first part of my life, I grew up in Sri Lanka. So from the age of about 2 till the age of 5, I grew up in Sri Lanka.
Okay.
And my third one is I used to have a job dressed as a Christmas pudding, giving out leaflets and flyers at Manchester Airport to people as they were on their way to go on holiday at Christmas time.
Oh, God, you're sneaky. I'm trying to think of the first one, if that would give you... what was the height again of the story? Did you say a meter? More than a meter?
No, a first story window. So we're talking like 8, 9 foot. Maybe actually a bit higher, maybe 10 foot.
Oh, first story. Okay. Right. Okay. Ooh, no, that would have been some real bad injuries for sure, because that's a trauma case. If you come into ED, we class that as a trauma. Sri Lanka 2 to 5. Interesting. And then the pudding thing. Do you know what? I just hope the pudding thing's real, to be honest, because I just think that's so hilarious. I feel like that one's real. I feel like Sri Lanka is the false one. That's where my gut feeling's telling me. I think that is the lie, and that you actually had that injury and you actually dress as a pudding.
You would be correct. Um,
Yeah.
so my dad grew up in Sri Lanka because his dad, my grandfather, was in the Navy. So he was based at a naval base in Trincomalee in Sri Lanka. My dad grew up in the 1950s for the first part of his life there. So it wasn't
Ah,
me. I grew up in the very exotic suburbs of Stockport in South Manchester, which is not quite as tropical, but
no. And the pudding story? That's hilarious.
The pudding story. Let me tell you more about the pudding story because it's connected to my HIV story. So, the
Oh.
pudding, I used to work giving out these flyers, Christmas promotion. So it'd be airside. So just everyone's gone through security and they're just coming through to where like duty free and shopping is. So this is like, the nice part of the airport experience. You've done all that. And we'd stand at the end of this long corridor with people coming from the security towards us, either dressed as a Christmas pudding or a Roomba reindeer. I didn't know what a Roomba reindeer was, so I went with Christmas pudding. So you'd stand there and you'd do a shift from 5 a.m. till like 11 a.m. So you'd be up at like 4 in the morning, really early. Your hands sort of like just stick out of this like massive pudding costume and your hand. So you can't really hold the flyers properly. You're just trying to hand them out. And I'm doing this. I've done about 5 shifts in a row. And the guy that I contracted HIV from, who was an air steward, who I'd not seen for about 4 or 5 years. No, maybe like 3 years, came round the corner, walking towards me. Now, in my head, in the film of my life, he was like flanked by two beautiful like other air stewardesses. There was a wind machine, they're all tan, I'm looking haggard like this, like in this frumpy costume. And he was walking to I was just like, no, this is not happening. This is not happening. So I've not spoken to him since it happened. So I tried to hide behind a pillar, a big structural pillar, but it wasn't wide enough, so you could still see me. Just my
Because
my
you're a
hands were
pudding.
stuck behind this pillar. So I then decided I jumped in a stock cupboard, just like at the last minute, and managed to sort of hide from him. And yeah, so that was. I just was like, I couldn't face him anyway. Never mind dressed as a Christmas pudding.
Oh my God. That is traumatic. That is traumatic.
It is, but it paid £10 an hour, which back then was a lot of money. So
So you put up with it, even with the psychological stress that you had to deal with. You're like, hey, I still got
yeah,
my £10
yeah,
an hour.
yeah. That job funded my trip around Australia. So
Okay, that was worth it. That was worth it. Have you had a conversation with him since?
So we've our paths have crossed a couple of times, very briefly. So no, not really. Although he did reach out late last year because my second show, Toxic, was just about to premiere, and he reached out. He found an email, my work email address, and emailed me, but I haven't got back to him. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. I don't know. We'll see.
As in apologizing or saying he's.
Just to say, like, if you want to chat, I'm here. Like, so I guess
Yeah.
I've done a lot of talking, and maybe he does have a right to reply on that.
Oh, so I think we should definitely follow your Instagram to see if maybe there's a show that comes out with this, because that sounds like a story in itself that definitely needs to be played out in a show. Okay, well, this was a very interesting Two Truths and a Lie. We have learnt a lot. We are going to get back into the episode, everybody. It's incredible because, you doing that one theatre show, if you think back, you did it for yourself, to get out there and be authentically yourself, unapologetically yourself, and try and heal yourself in a way. That one move has now impacted thousands of people across the world and will continue to impact thousands of people. So it's pretty incredible that just this one move of being open has impacted such a massive amount of the population. So, whether you keep doing this for a long time or whatever you've done now, like, I'm so grateful that you have opened your voice and shared this story, because it is so fucking powerful, and it's exactly what I want to do in terms of the herpes community and just and all, sexual, transmitted diseases, infections, whatever you like to call it. I want to do this for all of them, because we all love sex. We're all of us, every single one of us fucking loves sex. And a lot of this podcast, I talk a lot about spicy topics, which is sex, because we all want it, and we are too scared to talk about it, right? And I want to be that person who talks about it. But unfortunately, sometimes we get into some risky behaviors and we get some things. So why don't you just learn from us? And hey, if you get it too, you're okay. Just be a part of the community and talk about it. But I've just noticed as well, like telling people like at house parties and stuff, like as you said, in an Ubers or a taxi, and when you talked about that hairdresser and you had that, you weren't sure at how the reaction was going to be. It's a very uncomfortable situation. I disappeared and became a travel nurse, and like was in like the middle of New South Wales, and I just ran away, and I tested telling people on complete people that have just met, right? So I'd be having dinner with somebody who's another nurse, and I would just be like, yeah, so I got herpes, and they were just like, oh yeah, my sister's got that, or my friend's got that. And I was so accepted. I've actually, to this day, never really had like a negative experience about opening up and telling somebody. Like nothing, yes, maybe I'm rejected sexually, or someone maybe doesn't want to date me. That's life. Sometimes they just don't want to date me without a herpes diagnosis, because that's just the world, right? I'll just blame the herpes, but it's just me. But like, it's just, it's just something that I've spoken so much about, and I've actually realized, wow, people aren't going to respond to me negatively. Like they're not responding negatively like I thought in my head. I thought someone was going to be like, ew, that's disgusting. Like I've seen videos on that on it, or pictures on Google. You're disgusting. Like no one's ever going to sleep with you again. That's what I had in my head. And have you had the same thing where the more you've spoken about it, the more people have actually reacted in quite a positive, maybe curious, maybe uneducated, but mostly positive?
Yeah, well, when I first started, when I was telling people when I was sort of more secret, and I sort of was at university and kind of in my younger years, often when I tell people, they would cry. I'd be like, "This is the wrong way around. Like, you should be comforting me." But obviously, when we think about HIV, people's knowledge of HIV and what they know, particularly at that time, was very much from the 80s and 90s. And you think about HIV in the media, so it's mostly historic. So all the films are historic, but Dallas Buyers Club, 120 BPM, Angels in America, there's lots of plays, The Normal Heart, Philadelphia, the film, and then all the kind of famous people, Rock Hudson and Freddie Mercury. And people's kind of feeling around HIV is a death sentence. You're going to die a really horrific, painful death. You're going to be ostracized by society. So I understand that big reaction when you sort of tell people, and I think that is easing and changing, as we move through this, into the 2020s, for sure. So, but I think mostly the reactions I've had have been good and positive, but it's difficult to say, because what if you're sort of open, say on like a dating app, for example, you don't know who is sort of what we call zero sorting, so choosing based on HIV status, so whether you're HIV positive or HIV negative. And before we knew about U equals U, you would often find that some HIV positive people would say, "I'm only sleeping with HIV positive people," which is just a way of like going, I don't need to deal with all that kind of rejection from other people or whatever. But also now we have PrEP, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is HIV medication taken before sex, which is really effective at stopping transmission. So it's a prophylaxis. It's not a vaccine, but it's the similar medication to what I take. And you can either take it regularly every single day, if you're having lots of sex, which is great. If you're having lots of sex with different partners, and that's your kind
Zam.
yeah, you considered high risk, in that sense. Or you can take it on an event basis. So, for example, I don't know, like Pride's coming up, it's Sydney Mardi Gras or something. You're going to have a big weekend. that might involve having sex with someone or a few people. So you double dose 2 hours before, you take 2 tablets before, and then you take it one every day, every 24 hours for 2 days after the sex had taken place as well. And that's also quite effective, because some people don't want to take the medication, every day, and that's totally understandable. In the UK, it's available on our National Health Service for free. There was a big fight to get it for free, but not everyone knows about it. But that's also changed the landscape as well, because it means it's not just people living with HIV who are sort of holding responsibility. Like everyone can do things. Obviously, condoms remain really effective at stopping HIV transmission, and getting tested regularly is really important. But that's changed the landscape again. And, when I met my current boyfriend, who knew I was HIV positive already because he'd seen my show, that's how we met, which is quite cute.
It's also really helpful because you don't have to have the conversation, right? You're like, cool, you already know.
It's literally like he sat through a therapy session, like just watched me have therapy, essentially.
Yeah, he saw all your baggage, like right there and then.
Exactly.
Love it.
And it was during coronavirus, so during lockdown, when we would sort of started chatting, and when we could eventually meet, we've been sort of dating virtually for a while. And then it was sort of coming towards where it was like, oh yeah, this is definitely going to go further. And he spoke to me, he said to me, he said to me, I'm taking PrEP. How do you want to go? How do you want to navigate sex? Like what would be most comfortable for you? And that was the first time in my whole adult life that somebody else had raised the issue before I had. Someone had acknowledged and done the emotional heavy lifting of that conversation about how do you want to navigate this? Do you want to use a condom? Like, do you want to both get tested? There was that level of care that he showed I'd never had from anyone else. And PrEP allows us to do that as well. It's never been easier for HIV negative people, particularly in the queer community and, the gay and bisexual male community where HIV is more prevalent, is to take that conversation out of my hands, because I realized at that point for nearly 20 years, I had been going around with a weight of going, okay, how do I start this conversation? Do I need to tell this person? Like, do I need to disclose to this person if it's just a one night thing? Like, do I want to do, and that just is like a bit of a buzzkill over time.
Doesn't make you horny anymore having to have that conversation, does it?
And you can understand why then I fell into like sex and drugs, because actually sex whilst high is easier because I don't need to think about it. And that's an easy way to become sexually confident and just go, fine, and fuck it, I don't need to think about these things when I'm high, and all those worries can go. And so falling into that, and whilst I wasn't really, I skirted what's called the chemsex scene, which is a part of an underside to the gay community. People having sex for quite a long time with a lot of people on quite strong drugs like crystal meth, or G, which is quite prevalent, in gay communities across the world. And is a real issue. I sort of just skirted that. I didn't fall deep into that like some people do. But you can understand why, as a place to escape all those worries and those fears, because even if you live with HIV within our community, we are so vilified, and it's been so much a part. If you've grown up in the 80s and 90s and noughties, for the last 40 years, we've all lived with the fear of this virus, despite the fact that it actually globally impacts straight people more. But that's a different thing. It's the way that it's impacted our community very specifically. And I think that's why we see, a lot, that's had a profound impact on the way that people interact with one another as well. And I have a lot of compassion for people who find themselves falling into, that world of chemsex or partying, because actually I get it. I get that sometimes the weight of all that is too much. And if you can take a drug and have a good time to forget it, then you do. But obviously that can become very problematic over time.
Absolutely. So before we do wrap up, you have shared honestly so many incredible points, and I thank you so much for being on this podcast with me. A statistic that I looked at actually just in Australia, it says that 29,000 people in Australia alone have HIV. They've been positive for HIV, and 95% of those people are on treatment. and that treatment has made them 98% undetectable within their bloods, which is so crazy. And it would show why, as a nurse, working clinically, that I don't see it very much, because it is so well managed. They don't really need to disclose it to me. They can disclose it to the doctor if it's relevant to why they're coming into hospital. But it just makes sense why I don't really see it very much, because our incredible healthcare system is on top of it with all these medications, and we're on the right path. I think you and I were on the right path about, the psychological side of things and talking about these things and smashing stigmas. So, Nathaniel, thank you so much, all the way from Australia, for coming on to Oh Really podcast with me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So excited. And guys, I'm going to put Nathaniel's Instagram details and everything on the show notes as well. If you want to follow him, give him a follow all his journey, because he's got some incredible things coming up and he's been involved in some amazing projects. And I'm so proud and honored that you have come on Oh Really podcast. So thank you, everyone. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review and share the love. Bye.